They called me the disappointment my entire life, said I'd never amount to anything more than the girl who couldn't even graduate high school. My own family bet money that I'd be back home pregnant and broken within 6 months of enlisting. They had no idea that 7 years later, I'd be the lieutenant commanding the convoy that shut down Main Street in our hometown, not for a parade, but for a federal investigation that would expose everything they thought they knew about our perfect family business. What started as their biggest shame became their worst nightmare. And it all began the day I walked back into Morrison's hardware, wearing these stripes they said I'd never earn. The bell above Morrison's hardware chimed the same way it had when I was 16, but everything else had changed. I stood in the doorway wearing my Army dress blues, 7 years of training, and 2 deployments pressed into every crease. The afternoon sun caught my lieutenant's bars as I stepped onto the familiar wooden floors that still creaked in all the same places. My Uncle Derek looked up from behind the counter, and for just a moment his face went completely blank. Not surprised, blank. Like his brain was trying to process something that didn't compute with the reality he'd constructed about me. "Well, I'll be damned," he finally muttered, but there was no warmth in it. "Look what the Army dragged back to town." My cousin Marcus emerged from the back office, tool belt hanging loose around his waist, grease under his fingernails from whatever project he'd been working on. He stopped short when he saw me, then let out a laugh that had nothing to do with humor. "Jesus, Alex, what's with the costume? You here for Halloween or something?" I didn't flinch. 7 years of military discipline had taught me how to stand perfectly still while people tried to cut me down to size. I let my eyes sweep the store. The same cluttered aisles, the same handwritten price tags, the same family photos behind the register that somehow never included me, even from before I left. The photographs were a collection of Morrison family milestones spanning decades. Derek's wedding, Marcus's high school graduation, various family barbecues and holiday gatherings, even pictures of distant cousins I barely knew. But not a single image included me, not even from when I was small and still considered part of the family narrative. It was as if I'd been systematically edited out of their history long before I'd made the choice to leave. "I came to pay my respects," I said simply. "Heard about Grandpa Joe." Derek's expression hardened. "Funeral was last week, family only." The emphasis on family hit exactly the way he intended it to. "I was overseas," I replied. "Couldn't get leave approved in time." "Convenient excuse," Marcus said, crossing his arms. "Just like when you ran away from your high school graduation. Just like when you missed Mom's birthday party. Just like—" "I enlisted," I cut him off, voice level but firm. "There's a difference between running away and choosing a different path." Derek snorted. "Different path? Alex, you dropped out of high school to join the military because you couldn't handle real life. Don't dress it up like it was some noble calling." The words stung because they echoed every conversation we'd had before I left. Every family dinner where they'd joked about my grades, my future, my complete lack of direction. Every prediction that I'd washed out of basic training and come crawling back within months. I remembered the last family gathering before I enlisted. It had been Derek's birthday, and everyone had gathered in his backyard for a barbecue. I'd been working at the local grocery store, barely keeping up with rent on my tiny apartment, struggling with classes I couldn't afford to fail but couldn't seem to pass either. "Alex doesn't know what she wants to do with her life," Derek had announced to the assembled relatives, as if I wasn't standing right there holding a plate of potato salad. "Some people are just late bloomers, I guess, or maybe some people just don't bloom at all." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, exactly, but it wasn't kind either. It was the sound of people who'd given up on you but were trying to be polite about it. That night, I'd gone home and pulled out the military recruitment brochures I'd been hiding in my dresser drawer for months. Not because I had some burning desire to serve my country, but because I was drowning in a life that felt too small for me, surrounded by people who seemed determined to keep me small. But what they couldn't see, what they'd never bothered to ask about, was the transformation that had happened after I left. The scared 17-year-old who'd signed her enlistment papers with shaking hands was gone. In her place stood someone who'd led supply convoys through hostile territory, who'd earned commendations for logistics excellence, who'd been trusted with million-dollar equipment and the lives of soldiers under her command. I'd deployed twice to Afghanistan, managing supply chains that kept forward operating bases running. I'd coordinated helicopter resupply missions in contested territory. I'd been promoted ahead of schedule because my commanding officers recognized something in me that my own family had never seen: leadership potential. The last performance review I'd received from Colonel Martinez had been particularly memorable. Lieutenant Morrison demonstrates exceptional logistical coordination under pressure. Her ability to manage complex supply operations while maintaining personnel safety is exemplary. Recommended for advanced leadership training and early promotion consideration. Standing in Morrison's hardware looking at my uncle's dismissive expression, I wondered what he'd think of that evaluation, or what he'd say if he knew that my unit had been commended for maintaining a 99.8% supply delivery success rate in one of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. "How's the store doing?" I asked, changing the subject. It was a genuine question, but Derek's eyes narrowed like I was setting some kind of trap. "We're managing just fine without you, if that's what you're getting at." I wasn't getting at anything, but his defensiveness was interesting. Morrison's hardware had been the family business for 3 generations. My great-grandfather had started it in 1952 with a loan from the local bank and a determination to serve the growing suburban community around Millbrook. Grandpa Joe had expanded it through the 1970s and 80s, adding lawn and garden supplies, a key-cutting service, and eventually a small lumber yard out back. The store had been the anchor of our family's identity for as long as I could remember. Growing up, I had spent countless hours here after school, sorting screws, stocking shelves, learning the difference between Phillips head and flathead screwdrivers. Grandpa Joe used to say that hardware stores were where communities were built. One project, one repair, one solution at a time. But looking around now, I noticed things that hadn't registered immediately. Empty shelves where popular items used to be stocked. Dust on merchandise that should have been moving. The key-cutting machine in the corner looked like it hadn't been used in months. The paint section, which used to be meticulously organized by color families, was a chaotic mess of half-empty cans and discontinued colors. Most tellingly, the customer traffic was almost non-existent. On a Thursday afternoon, the store should have been bustling with contractors picking up supplies for weekend projects, homeowners browsing for solutions to their latest repair challenges. Instead, it felt empty and somehow forgotten. "Actually," Derek continued, "we've been expanding. New contracts with the county, some big development projects. Business is better than it's ever been." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, we're not the same small-town shop you left behind, Alex. We're playing in the big leagues now." Something in their tone felt rehearsed, like they'd practiced this conversation. Marcus had always been a terrible liar. Even as kids, he'd get this overly excited tone when he was trying to cover up something he'd done wrong. Like the time he'd broken Grandpa Joe's antique level and tried to convince everyone it had fallen off the wall by itself. "What kind of county contracts?" I asked, genuinely curious. Millbrook wasn't exactly a hotbed of municipal development. The biggest construction project in recent memory had been the new traffic light at Main and Cedar, and that had taken 3 years of town hall meetings to approve. Derek and Marcus exchanged a glance that was so quick I almost missed it. But 7 years of military training had taught me to notice the micro-expressions that people thought they were hiding. "Oh, you know," Derek said vaguely. "Infrastructure stuff. Roads. Municipal buildings. Boring contractor supply stuff." Before I could ask for more specifics, the store's back door opened, and a man I didn't recognize walked in. Expensive suit, polished shoes, the kind of clean-shaven look that screamed government contract or corporate money. Everything about him was precisely put together, from his perfectly knotted tie to his manicured fingernails. He was carrying a leather briefcase and moved with the confident stride of someone who expected doors to open for him. When he saw me, he stopped mid-step, his eyes taking in my uniform with the practiced assessment of someone who knew military ranks and understood exactly what they meant. "Lieutenant," he said with a slight nod. "I'm sorry, gentlemen. I didn't realize you had family visiting." Quote. Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She was just leaving." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. I'm Robert Henley, by the way. Regional Development Coordinator." He extended his hand, and I shook it automatically, noting the firmness of his grip and the way his eyes never quite met mine directly. His handshake was the kind that was designed to convey authority. Firm but not aggressive, confident but not domineering. The handshake of someone who spent a lot of time convincing people to sign things they might not fully understand. "Alexandra Morrison," I said, "though it's been a few years since I've been back to town." "Morrison?" His eyebrows raised slightly. "As in Morrison's Hardware Morrison?" "Derek's niece," Marcus supplied quickly. "She's just passing through." The speed with which Marcus answered, the way Derek shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, the fact that this Robert Henley seemed to know exactly who the Morrison family was, it all felt carefully orchestrated. Like I'd walked into the middle of a play where everyone knew their lines except me. I studied Henley more carefully. Regional development coordinator for what, exactly? Millbrook didn't have the kind of development that required coordination. The town's biggest economic engine was still the paper mill on the outskirts of town, and that had been there since before I was born. "What kind of development are you coordinating in Millbrook?" I asked directly. Henley's smile became a fraction more strained. "Oh, various municipal improvement projects. You'd be surprised how much infrastructure work a growing community requires." Growing community? Millbrook had been steadily losing population for the past decade as younger people moved to bigger cities for better job opportunities. The last time I'd checked, the population was barely holding steady at 8,500 people. "That's interesting," I said. "I didn't realize Millbrook was experiencing that kind of growth." Derek cleared his throat loudly. "Alex, I'm sure Mr. Henley has important business to discuss with us. Maybe you could." "Actually," Henley interrupted smoothly, "I'd love to hear more about your military service, Lieutenant Morrison. How long have you been in the Army?" The question seemed genuine enough, but something about the way he asked it felt like a probe. Like he was gathering information rather than making conversation. 7 years, I replied, currently stationed at Fort Campbell. Quote, "Fort Campbell," he repeated thoughtfully. "That's the 101st Airborne Division, isn't it? Air assault specialists?" Most civilians wouldn't know that level of detail about military installations. Robert Henley was either very well informed about military matters, or he'd done some homework before this conversation. "Among other units, yes," I said carefully. "And what's your specialty, if you don't mind me asking?" Derek was practically vibrating with discomfort now, shifting from foot to foot behind the counter like he wanted to physically insert himself between me and Henley. "Logistics and supply chain management," I answered. Something flickered in Henley's eyes. Interest, maybe? Or calculation? "Fascinating field. I imagine you've developed quite an eye for irregularities in supply chains, efficiency problems, unauthorized diversions, that sort of thing." The way he said it made it sound less like casual conversation and more like a job interview. Or a warning. "You could say that," I replied evenly. "Well, it was lovely meeting you, Lieutenant Morrison," Henley said, his professional smile sliding back into place. "I'm sure your family is very proud of your service." The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a box cutter from aisle 3. I looked from Derek to Marcus to this stranger, who seemed to know more about what was happening in my family store than I did. 7 years of military intelligence training had taught me to recognize when something didn't add up. And right now, nothing about this scene made sense. The hardware store I'd grown up in had been a straightforward family business. Buy tools and supplies from distributors, sell them to local customers, maintain relationships with contractors and homeowners in the community. Simple, honest, profitable enough to support the family for 3 generations. But the conversation I'd just witnessed felt like something else entirely. Corporate development coordinators didn't typically conduct business in small-town hardware stores unless there was something much bigger happening than simple retail sales. "I should get going," I said finally. "I'm sure you have business to discuss." As I walked toward the door, I heard Derek's voice behind me, lower now but still carrying, "Thanks for stopping by, Alex. Don't be a stranger." But his tone suggested the exact opposite, that being a stranger was exactly what he preferred. I pushed through the door, the bell chiming my exit, and stood on the sidewalk outside the store that had been in my family for 3 generations. The same store where I'd spent countless afternoons as a kid, learning to sort screws and cut keys and dream about a future that somehow always seemed just out of reach. The main street of Millbrook stretched out in both directions, lined with the same mix of small businesses and empty storefronts that had defined the town for as long as I could remember. Murphy's Diner still anchored one end of the block, its neon sign flickering with the same erratic pattern it had maintained for the past decade. The old movie theater sat dark and abandoned, its marquee advertising a film from 2019 that no one had bothered to change. But there were some differences I hadn't noticed from inside the hardware store. Several buildings that I remembered as occupied were now empty, their windows covered with brown paper and for lease signs. The barber shop where I'd gotten my haircut as a kid was gone, replaced by something called Millbrook Development Solutions, with professional-looking signage and tinted windows. Most significantly, there were more cars parked on Main Street than I'd ever seen during my childhood. Expensive cars. BMWs, Mercedes, a few high-end pickup trucks that looked like they'd never seen actual work. The kind of vehicles that didn't belong in a town where the average household income was barely above the poverty line. I walked slowly down the sidewalk, taking in these changes and trying to piece together what they might mean. The military had taught me to gather intelligence methodically, to observe patterns and anomalies before drawing conclusions. Pattern: empty local businesses, replaced by development-related companies. Anomaly: expensive vehicles in an economically struggling town. Pattern: my family's defensive behavior around a development coordinator. Anomaly: a hardware store with empty shelves claiming to have the best business in its history. None of it added up to anything good. I pulled out my phone and typed a quick text to my old friend Jamie, who still lived in town. Coffee tomorrow? Need to catch up on local news. Her response came back almost immediately. Yes, O'Malley's at 10? So much to tell you. The enthusiasm in her reply suggested that Jamie had noticed the same changes I was picking up on. And knowing Jamie, she'd have details. Lots of them. I walked back to my rental car, a nondescript sedan that fit perfectly with the military's emphasis on blending in rather than standing out. As I unlocked the door, I caught a glimpse of movement in the hardware store's front window. Derek and Marcus were standing behind the counter, clearly visible from the street, talking animatedly with Robert Henley. All 3 men were watching me. I got in the car and started the engine, but I didn't drive away immediately. Instead, I sat there for a moment, letting the weight of the afternoon settle around me. 7 years ago, I'd left Millbrook as the family disappointment. The girl who couldn't even finish high school. The one they'd bet money would fail at everything she tried. Now, wearing the uniform they'd said I'd never earn, I realized I'd walked into something much bigger than a simple homecoming visit. The question was, what exactly was Robert Henley doing in my family's hardware store? And why did Derek and Marcus look like they'd been caught doing something they shouldn't? More importantly, what was happening to my hometown and how was my family involved? As I pulled away from the curb, I caught one more glimpse of the 3 men in the store window. They were still watching, still talking, still looking like people who had secrets they were desperate to protect. Because if there was one thing the Army had taught me, it was that when something felt wrong, it usually was. And Lieutenant Alexandra Morrison had learned a long time ago that sometimes the best way to solve a problem was to gather intelligence first and ask questions later. 7 years ago, I'd left this town as their biggest disappointment. Something told me I wasn't going to leave the same way twice. In fact, something told me I was about to discover exactly what happened when someone they'd written off came back with the training and authority to ask the right questions. And I had a feeling that when I found the answers, I'd understand exactly why they'd been so eager to bet against me 7 years ago. Because people who are hiding something always prefer to keep the people who might expose them as far away as possible. Too bad for them that Lieutenant Alexandra Morrison didn't take hints. O'Malley's coffee shop hadn't changed much in 7 years, except for the prices and the fact that half the tables were now occupied by people I didn't recognize. Jamie Chen sat in our old corner booth, the same spot where we'd spent countless hours during high school complaining about teachers, parents, and the general unfairness of teenage existence. She looked exactly the same, Wild curly hair, barely contained by a scrunchie, paint-stained fingers wrapped around an oversized coffee mug, and the kind of animated expression that suggested she'd been storing up stories for months just waiting for someone to tell them to. "Holy shit, Alex," she said before I'd even sat down. "You look like you could actually kick someone's ass now." "Language, Jamie," I replied with a grin, sliding into the booth across from her. "There might be children present." "Please. The only children in this place are the 40-year-old developers who throw tantrums when their lattes aren't hot enough." She gestured around the coffee shop, which was indeed filled with more suits than I'd ever seen in Millbrook. "Welcome to the new Millbrook, where everything's for sale and nobody's asking questions about who's buying." I followed her gaze around the room. She was right. At least half the customers looked like they'd driven in from somewhere much more expensive than our little town. Designer clothes, expensive watches, the kind of confident posture that came from having money and knowing how to use it. Speaking of nobody asking questions, I said, "I had an interesting visit to the family store yesterday." Jamie's expression immediately shifted from casual excitement to something much more serious. "Oh, Alex, please tell me you didn't walk into that mess unprepared." "What mess?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Your family's hardware store isn't just selling screws and paint anymore. It's the distribution hub for the biggest development scam this county has ever seen." The coffee I'd just sipped suddenly tasted bitter. "What are you talking about?" Jamie pulled out her phone and opened a folder full of screenshots and photos. "I've been documenting this for months, ever since my dad's construction company got squeezed out of every major contract in the county. Look at this." She showed me a photo of a county planning commission meeting. The image showed a packed room with a banner reading Millbrook Regional Development Initiative. In the front row, I could clearly see Derek and Marcus sitting next to Robert Henley. "Your uncle and cousin have been at every single planning meeting for the past 8 months, Jamie explained. "They're not just attending, they're presenting." Derek's listed as a local business liaison for something called Henley Development Group. My stomach dropped. Henley Development Group? As in Robert Henley? The same Robert Henley who's been buying up property all over the county for the past 2 years. Residential, commercial, agricultural, you name it. And here's the kicker. Every single purchase goes through Morrison's Hardware as the, quote, local business partner. She swiped to another screenshot, this one showing a property deed. Morrison's Hardware was listed as a co-signatory on the purchase of a 200-acre farm just outside of town. "Jamie, hardware stores don't buy farms." "Exactly, but they do if they're fronting for someone who wants to hide where their money is coming from." She pulled up another document. "This is a state filing for Henley Development Group. Want to guess who's listed as the registered agent?" I already knew, but I asked anyway. "Derek?" "Derek Morrison, owner of Morrison's Hardware, listed as the local representative for all Henley Development Group activities in Millbrook County." Jamie's voice was getting tighter with each revelation. "Alex, your family's store is being used to launder property purchases for a development company that's systematically buying up the entire county." The implications hit me like a physical blow. "And they're hiding it behind the hardware store, because nobody would ever suspect a small family business of being involved in something like this." "Worse than that," Jamie continued. "Remember how I said my dad's construction company got squeezed out? It's not just him. Every local contractor, every family-owned business that used to get county work, they're all gone. Replaced by companies that don't even exist until they win the bid, then disappear again after the work is done." She showed me a list of recent county contracts. The winning bidders were all companies I'd never heard of: Millbrook Infrastructure Solutions, Regional Construction Partners, County Development Associates. "I did some digging," Jamie said. "Every single one of these companies has the same business address, a P.O. box registered to Morrison's Hardware." Quote, I stared at the documents, my military training kicking in to process the information systematically. This wasn't just a simple case of a family business getting involved with the wrong people. This was a carefully orchestrated operation using my family store as the cornerstone of an elaborate fraud scheme. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked. Jamie's expression grew even more grim. "In the past 18 months, conservative estimate based on public records? About $12 million in property purchases and county contracts." $12 million. In a town where the median household income was barely $35,000 a year, that kind of money represented a complete economic takeover. And nobody's investigating this? Who's going to investigate? The county commissioners who are approving all the contracts? The mayor whose campaign was funded by Henley Development Group? The local police chief whose department just got a brand new station courtesy of, quote, anonymous donors? Jamie pulled up one more document, a photo of a campaign finance filing. Mayor Patricia Williams had received $15,000 in donations from something called the Millbrook Business Coalition. The treasurer listed for the coalition was Derek Morrison. Your uncle has been funneling money to local politicians for almost 2 years, Jamie explained. Not enough to be illegal, but more than enough to buy loyalty. I sat back in the booth, trying to process the full scope of what she was telling me. My family hadn't just gotten involved with suspicious business partners. They'd become the local face of a systematic takeover of our entire community. There's more, Jamie said quietly, and this part is going to hurt. How could there possibly be more? She hesitated, then pulled up a final document. This is Grandpa Joe's death certificate. I looked at the official document, noting the date and cause of death. Natural causes, heart failure. Nothing unusual there. Now look at this, Jamie continued, showing me another document. This is the property deed transfer for the hardware store, from Joe Morrison to Derek Morrison. The transfer was dated 3 days before Grandpa Joe's death. That's impossible, I said. He was in the hospital. I got the call from Derek saying he'd passed peacefully in his sleep. Quote, Alex, Jamie said gently, according to the hospital records I was able to access through my mom's work at the county clerk's office, your grandfather was awake and alert until the day he died. He was scheduled to be discharged the following week. The room suddenly felt too small. Are you saying? I'm saying that a man who was scheduled to go home from the hospital somehow signed over his life's work to his son 3 days before he unexpectedly died of heart failure. I stared at the documents, my hands trembling slightly. The implications were too horrible to process all at once. Had my family been involved in something even worse than fraud? There's one more thing, Jamie said, her voice barely above a whisper. The day before your grandfather's property transfer, he called my mom at the county clerk's office. He wanted to know how to file a complaint about fraudulent business practices. He specifically mentioned concerns about someone using Morrison's hardware for unauthorized activities. The coffee shop around us seemed to fade into background noise. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my grandfather's death, about my place in the Morrison legacy, all of it was crumbling. Why didn't you tell me any of this when it was happening? I asked. Jamie's eyes filled with tears. Because you were deployed, and I couldn't reach you. And because... She hesitated. Because Derek told everyone that you'd burned all your bridges with the family. He said you'd made it clear you wanted nothing to do with Millbrook or the Morrison name. People believed him. Of course they had. Derek had spent years establishing the narrative that I was the irresponsible one, the disappointment who'd run away from her problems. It would have been easy for people to believe that I'd also run away from my family obligations. Plus, Jamie continued, I wasn't sure how deep this went. I didn't know if you might be involved somehow or if contacting you might make things worse. I understood her hesitation, but it still stung. While I'd been serving my country, believing that my family was carrying on Grandpa Joe's honest legacy, they'd been using his business to facilitate what amounted to the systematic destruction of our community. What happened to all the families who lost their farms? I asked. Most of them moved away. Couldn't afford to stay once their land was gone and there was no work. The Hendersons, the Patels, the Williams family, all gone. The only people left are either working for Henley Development Group or can't afford to leave. I thought about the expensive cars I'd seen on Main Street, the new businesses with corporate-sounding names, the general sense that Millbrook was becoming something alien to itself. It's not just the county either, Jamie added. I've been in touch with people in 3 neighboring counties and the same thing is happening everywhere. Same pattern, same players, just different local business partners fronting the operation. How widespread are we talking? Potentially the entire region. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in property transfers, all flying under the radar because they're using small-town businesses as cover. The scope of it was staggering. This wasn't just local corruption. It was a systematic operation designed to quietly buy up entire rural regions without attracting federal attention. Jamie, do you have copies of all these documents? Everything I could legally access, plus some things I probably shouldn't have been able to access. She gave me a meaningful look. Why? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in over a year. Captain Sarah Rodriguez had been my commanding officer during my second deployment, and she'd moved on to work with the Army's Criminal Investigation Command. More importantly, she'd told me to call if I ever encountered anything that might be of interest to federal law enforcement. Because I think it's time to involve some people who have the authority to do something about this. Jamie's eyes widened. Alex, you need to be careful. These people have been planning this for years. And they've bought off everyone who matters locally. If they think you're a threat, then they clearly don't understand what kind of threat I actually am, I said, feeling a familiar surge of determination that had gotten me through basic training, through combat deployments, through every challenge the Army had thrown at me. My phone rang before I could call Captain Rodriguez. The caller ID showed Derek's number. Alex, his voice was tight when I answered. We need to talk. Can you come back to the store? Is everything okay? Just come back to the store. There are some things about Grandpa Joe that you need to know. Jamie was watching my face as I listened to Derek's voice. When I hung up, she immediately asked, What did he say? He wants to talk about Grandpa Joe. Says there are things I need to know. Alex, don't go back there alone. If they know that you know. They don't know what I know yet, I said, standing up from the booth. But they're about to find out exactly what kind of mistake they made when they counted me out 7 years ago. I left money on the table for both our coffees and headed toward the door. Jamie caught up with me in the parking lot. Promise me you'll be careful, she said. And promise me you won't go in there without backup. I thought about the weight of my service weapon, which I was legally authorized to carry even while on leave. I thought about the combat training that had become as natural as breathing. And I thought about the systematic destruction of everything my grandfather had built, carried out by people who'd written me off as too weak and too stupid to ever figure it out. I promise I'll be careful, I said, but I'm not promising to back down. As I drove back toward Morrison's Hardware, I couldn't shake the image of those property transfer documents. Grandpa Joe had built his business on trust, on handshake deals, and keeping his word. He'd always told me that the Morrison name meant something in this community, that it stood for honesty and reliability. Now that name was being used to systematically destroy the community he'd spent his life serving. Derek wanted to talk about things I needed to know about Grandpa Joe. Fine. But he was about to learn some things about Lieutenant Alexandra Morrison that he clearly hadn't factored into his carefully laid plans. The scared 17-year-old who'd left Millbrook 7 years ago wouldn't have known how to handle this situation. But the woman who'd coordinated supply operations in hostile territory, who'd been trained to identify and neutralize threats to mission success, who'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones who smiled while they stabbed you in the back, that woman was more than ready for whatever Derek Morrison thought he could throw at her. Because if there was one thing the Army had taught me, it was that every operation had vulnerabilities. And every enemy, no matter how well prepared they thought they were, eventually made mistakes. Derek and his partners had made their first mistake 7 years ago when they'd bet against me. They were about to discover that their second mistake was thinking I'd stay gone. And their third mistake, the one that was going to cost them everything, was believing that the Morrison family disappointment could never become the Morrison family's worst nightmare. But that's exactly what Lieutenant Alexandra Morrison was about to become. The hardware store felt different when I walked back in 20 minutes later. The same bell chimed, the same wooden floors creaked, but now I knew what I was really looking at. This wasn't my grandfather's honest family business. It was the nerve center of a criminal enterprise that had systematically destroyed my community. Derek was waiting behind the counter, but he wasn't alone. Marcus stood beside him, and Robert Henley sat in a chair that had been pulled up from the back office. All three men looked like they'd been having a very serious conversation. Alex, Derek said, his voice carefully controlled. Thanks for coming back. We've been talking, and we think it's time you knew the truth about some things. I remained standing near the door, keeping my exit route clear, a habit from deployment that had saved my life more than once. What kind of truth? Henley stood up, smoothing his expensive suit. The kind that could be very beneficial for everyone involved, including you. Mr. Henley, I said evenly, I'm not sure why you're part of a family conversation. Because, Derek said, he's been part of this family's business for the past 2 years, and because what we're about to offer you could set you up for life. Marcus stepped forward, his earlier hostility replaced by something that looked almost like desperation. Alex, we know you think we've been keeping you out of things, but the truth is, we've been protecting an opportunity. A big one. I felt the weight of my service weapon against my side and the vibration of my phone, which I'd set to silent after texting Captain Rodriguez with a brief message. Need to discuss potential federal case. Urgent. Her response had been immediate. Standing by. Location? What kind of opportunity? I asked. Henley resumed his seat and opened the briefcase he'd been carrying. Lieutenant Morrison, your family's hardware store has become the cornerstone of the most successful regional development initiative this part of the state has ever seen. Property values have increased by 400%. Employment opportunities have expanded dramatically. Tax revenue for the county has tripled. He pulled out a folder and placed it on the counter. Those are impressive statistics for any community development program. Except, I said, most of that money seems to be flowing out of the community, not into it. Derek's jaw tightened. Alex, you've been gone for 7 years. You don't understand how things work here anymore. Quote. Then explain it to me. Marcus and Derek exchanged a glance, then Derek nodded. Okay, here's the truth. 2 years ago, the store was failing. Online shopping was killing us. The big box stores in the county seat were taking all our business. We were 6 months away from bankruptcy. That's when I approached the Morrison family, Henley interjected. I saw the potential for Morrison's hardware to become something much more significant than a simple retail operation. What kind of potential? The potential to be the local face of legitimate economic development, Derek said. Henley Development Group needed a respected local business to partner with for property acquisitions and county contracts. We needed financial stability. It was a perfect match. I studied their faces. Derek looked like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. Marcus kept glancing toward the door like he expected someone else to arrive. Henley maintained his professional composure, but there was something calculating in his eyes. And Grandpa Joe was okay with this arrangement? The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Derek said, Dad was old-fashioned. He didn't understand the complexities of modern economic development. What does that mean? It means, Henley said smoothly, that your grandfather had some concerns about the scope of our partnership. Concerns that were ultimately unfounded, but which caused some family tension in his final months. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What kind of concerns? Marcus stepped forward again. Alex, Grandpa Joe thought we were moving too fast. He wanted to slow down, maybe even back out of some deals. But we couldn't do that. Too many people were depending on us by then. Too many people, like who? Like the county commissioners who'd already approved projects based on our commitments, Derek explained. Like the contractors who'd already been hired. Like the families who'd already sold their properties based on our development timeline. So you convinced him to stay involved? Another silence. Henley cleared his throat. Your grandfather signed the property transfer documents 3 days before his death. It was his final gift to his family, ensuring that Morrison's hardware could continue to serve as the cornerstone of Millbrook's economic future. Even though he was scheduled to be discharged from the hospital the following week, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Derek's face went pale. Marcus actually took a step backward. How do you know about that? Derek asked quietly. Because I've spent the morning learning about a lot of things, I replied. Like the fact that Morrison's hardware is the registered agent for shell companies that have purchased $12 million worth of property in the past 18 months. Like the fact that every local contractor who used to get county work has been systematically replaced by companies that don't exist until they win bids. Like the fact that my grandfather called the county clerk's office the day before his property transfer to ask about filing complaints for fraudulent business practices. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Finally, Henley spoke. Lieutenant Morrison, I think there may be some misunderstandings about the nature of our business relationships. Are there? I pulled out my phone and opened the photos Jamie had sent me. Because according to public records, Morrison's Hardware has been co-signing property purchases for farms, residential properties, and commercial buildings. Hardware stores don't typically invest in real estate portfolios. Derek's composure finally cracked. Alex, you need to understand. We didn't have a choice. The store was dying. This was the only way to save it. Save it for who? The families who've been forced to sell their land? The contractors who can't get work anymore? The community that's being systematically bought out from under them? Marcus stepped forward, his voice pleading. Alex, we can cut you in. There's enough money here for everyone. You could pay off your student loans, buy a house, set yourself up for when you get out of the military. With what money? The money from fraudulent county contracts? The money from property purchases that displace dozens of families? It's not fraud, Henley said sharply. Every transaction has been legal. Every contract has been properly bid and awarded. Through shell companies using Morrison's Hardware as a front, I countered. With county commissioners who've been receiving campaign contributions funneled through Derek. That's not legal. That's money laundering and corruption. Derek slammed his hand on the counter. God damn it, Alex. Do you think we wanted this? Do you think we planned for things to get this complicated? Quote, what I think, I said, is that you made a deal with someone you didn't fully understand, and then you got in too deep to back out. The truth of my words was written across Derek's face. Marcus looked like he might be sick. Henley, however, remained calm. Lieutenant Morrison, I think you're jumping to some unfortunate conclusions. Perhaps we should discuss this more privately. Actually, I said, I think we should discuss this with some additional parties present. I pulled out my phone and dialed Captain Rodriguez's number. She answered on the first ring. Captain Rodriguez? This is Lieutenant Morrison. I'm at the location we discussed, and I think it's time for that conversation about federal jurisdiction. Derek's face went white. Alex, what are you doing? Captain, I'm going to put you on speaker. I'm in the presence of 3 individuals who I believe have information relevant to a multi-county fraud investigation. I placed the phone on the counter and activated the speaker. This is Captain Sarah Rodriguez, U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Command. To whom am I speaking? Derek looked like he wanted to run. Marcus actually took another step toward the door. Henley, however, smiled. Captain Rodriguez, this is Robert Henley, Regional Development Coordinator. I think there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of our business operations here. Mr. Henley, I'm going to need you and the other individuals present to remain where you are. I have federal agents en route to your location. Derek grabbed my arm. Alex, please, we can work this out. We're family. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw desperation where I'd once seen authority, fear where I'd once seen confidence. Derek, I said quietly, if we were really family, you would have called me when Grandpa Joe started asking questions about what you were doing with his store. You would have called me when he died under suspicious circumstances. You would have called me when you decided to use the Morrison name to help destroy our community. We didn't have a choice. There's always a choice. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice cracking. Alex, they said if we didn't cooperate, they'd make sure the store went under. They said they'd ruin us financially, destroy our credit, make sure we could never work in this county again. Who said that? Marcus looked at Henley, who was no longer smiling. I think, Henley said carefully, this conversation has gone far enough. Quote, actually, said a new voice from the store's front door, I think it's just getting started. We all turned to see a woman in a dark suit with a federal badge clearly visible on her belt. She was followed by 2 more agents, and I could see additional vehicles pulling up outside through the front window. Special Agent Catherine Wells, FBI Financial Crimes Division, she announced. We have warrants for the search of these premises and the arrest of Robert Henley in connection with multi-state fraud and racketeering charges. Henley's calm facade finally cracked. This is a mistake. I'm a legitimate businessman. Mr. Henley, you're the subject of a federal investigation spanning 4 states and involving over $200 million in fraudulent property transactions. You have the right to remain silent. As Agent Wells continued reading Henley his rights, I watched Derek and Marcus realize that their world was about to collapse completely. Derek turned to me, his voice barely a whisper. "Alex, we never meant for anyone to get hurt." "But people did get hurt," I replied. "Dozens of families lost their homes and their livelihoods. Grandpa Joe died trying to expose what you were doing, and you let it happen because you were afraid." Agent Wells approached Derek and Marcus. "Derek Morrison and Marcus Morrison, you're also under arrest as material witnesses and potential co-conspirators in this investigation." As the agents led them away in handcuffs, Derek called over his shoulder, "Alex, please, take care of the store. Don't let them destroy everything Grandpa Joe built." I stood alone in Morrison's hardware, surrounded by federal agents photographing documents and boxing evidence. The store that had been in my family for 3 generations was now a crime scene. Agent Wells approached me as the evidence collection continued around us. "Lieutenant Morrison," she said, "your information was invaluable in helping us connect the final pieces of this investigation. We've been tracking Henley Development Group for 18 months, but we couldn't prove the money laundering component until we had access to local business records." "How widespread is this?" 4 states, 12 counties, over 300 separate property transactions. Conservative estimate of the total fraud? $250 million. The scope of it was staggering. My family's little hardware store had been a small cog in a massive criminal enterprise. "What happens now?" Quote, "There will be a trial. Your uncle and cousin will likely face federal charges, but their cooperation could result in reduced sentences. The properties purchased through fraudulent means will be returned to their original owners where possible, or the proceeds will be used to compensate victims." "And the store?" Agent Wells looked around at the cluttered aisles and handwritten price tags. "That depends on what you want to do with it." 3 days later, I stood on the front steps of Morrison's hardware wearing my dress blues, not for a homecoming this time, but for a press conference. The street was lined with news vans from regional television stations and newspapers, but more importantly, it was lined with people, former property owners, displaced contractors, families who'd been forced to leave Millbrook when their livelihoods disappeared. Captain Rodriguez stood beside me, along with Agent Wells and the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District, who was personally handling the prosecution. "Ladies and gentlemen," the U.S. Attorney began, "today marks the conclusion of one of the largest rural economic fraud schemes in this region's history. Thanks to the courage of Lieutenant Alexandra Morrison, who brought this criminal enterprise to federal attention, we have successfully dismantled a network that systematically defrauded communities across 4 states." The crowd applauded, but I could see the pain in many faces. Justice was important, but it couldn't undo the damage that had been done to so many lives. When it was my turn to speak, I looked out at the crowd and thought about Grandpa Joe, about the hardware store he'd built on trust and honesty, about the community values that had been corrupted by greed and fear. 7 years ago, I said, I left Millbrook as someone this community had written off. I was told I'd never amount to anything, that I'd never be successful, that I'd never make a difference. I paused, looking at the faces in the crowd. But the military taught me that success isn't measured by how much money you make or how much property you own. It's measured by how many people you serve, how much truth you're willing to defend, and how much courage you show when everything is on the line. I gestured toward the hardware store behind me. This store was built by my grandfather as a place where people could get what they needed to build their lives, fix their problems, and improve their communities. For the past 2 years, it was used to tear those communities apart. The crowd was completely silent now. But today I'm announcing that Morrison's hardware will be reopening under new management. Not as a front for criminal enterprise, but as what it was always meant to be, a community resource. I pulled out a document from my jacket. I'm establishing the Joseph Morrison Community Trust, which will use the recovered assets from this fraud case to provide low-interest loans for local contractors, grants for families who lost property, and resources for economic development that actually serves the people who live here. The applause was louder this time, and I could see tears in some eyes. More importantly, I continued, I'm requesting a transfer to the Army Reserve so I can move back to Millbrook and personally oversee this trust's operations. because this community gave me everything I needed to become the person I am today, and it's time for me to give something back. As the press conference ended and people began to approach me with stories of what they'd lost and hopes for what could be rebuilt, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 7 years ago, I'd left this town as their biggest disappointment. Today, I was returning as someone who'd learned that the most important victories aren't the ones you win for yourself. They're the ones you win for people who can't fight for themselves. The military convoy that would escort the evidence to federal court was scheduled to arrive tomorrow, shutting down Main Street for the transfer. It would be a visible reminder that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places, delivered by people who refuse to accept that things can't be changed. Derek and Marcus were currently in federal custody, facing charges that could result in significant prison time. But they were also cooperating with investigators, providing information that would help track down other victims and recover additional stolen assets. Henley had been denied bail and was facing charges in 4 states. His criminal network, which had operated under dozens of different company names, was being systematically dismantled by federal agents. But the real victory wasn't the arrests or the asset recovery. The real victory was standing in front of Morrison's hardware, wearing the uniform they'd said I'd never earn, announcing plans to rebuild the community they'd tried to destroy. The real victory was proving that sometimes the person everyone counts out is exactly the person who ends up counting the most. And as I looked out at the faces in the crowd, faces full of hope for the first time in years, I realized that Lieutenant Alexandra Morrison had finally found her way home. Not as the disappointment who'd run away from her problems, but as the solution to problems that ran much deeper than anyone had imagined. The hardware store bell chimed one more time as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. But this time, I wasn't walking into the past. I was walking into the future I was going to build, one honest transaction at a time. Just like Grandpa Joe had always intended. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.